Hi everybody. In this video I'm going to show you a solution to making the StepTracker class, and this solution will use a list. So when we're making the StepTracker class, we need to write a constructor along with three methods: add daily steps, active days, and average steps. Let's start by doing the constructor. So for our constructor, we need to look at our constructor call. StepTracker tr equals new StepTracker and 10,000, or some integer in the parentheses. So it looks like this 10,000 is going to symbolize the minimum number of days that we need in order for this to be considered an active day. So let's start with that. So first I'll write public class StepTracker, and then I will create my data fields. I won't exactly know what they are yet, but I know I need them. Then I'll make a constructor. When I make the constructor, I say public. I do not put a return type, so I do not put void or int or double or anything. Just public and then the name of the class, which is StepTracker. So I'll take that and put it here. Now my constructor also did need a parameter here. As you can see, it took in an integer. So I'll put an int in the parentheses, and College Board called this variable threshold. This is the minimum number of days that I need for this to be considered an active day. Now, when you make your constructor, typically when you take in a parameter, oftentimes you do want to store that as one of the properties of your object, which is stored in our data fields. So let's make a data field. This number threshold symbolized the minimum number of days needed for our day to be considered an active day. So we'll make a data field private int, and then we'll call it min steps, because that's the minimum number of steps that we need in order for this day to be considered active. When we make the constructor, we will set our data field min steps to become the value of the parameter, which is threshold. And then in our constructor, we still need to initialize or set a value to all the other data fields. We do not know what these are yet, but know that we will need to do this. Okay, so it looks like we finished most of the constructor. Let's go on to the other methods. We have add daily steps, which accumulates information about steps and readings taken once per day. So for add daily steps, this takes in a parameter 9,000, and for this day it is not considered active because 9,000 is not greater than or equal to this number, which is the minimum number of steps we need to be considered active. So since 9,000 is not greater than or equal to 10,000, then it's not considered an active day. 5,000 is another call. This is not considered active either because it's not greater than or equal to 10,000. However, if we call the method and put in 13,000, this is an active day because it is greater than or equal to 10,000. Before we begin, let's just do the method header. So it looks like nothing is getting returned. So for that reason, I will say public void, and then the name of our method, which is add daily steps. Let's see if it has parameters. It looks like it does have a parameter, which is the number of steps, which is an integer. So we will call this int steps. And we'll go ahead and stop there for now. We will probably need to put other things a little later. But notice this is probably going to be a mutator method because we are going to have to do something with that number of steps and figure out what's going on. So let's take a look at our next method, active days. This is going to return the number of active days. So as you can see here, again, this is not an active day and this is not an active day. So if I call active days the method, it will return 0. But as we go down here, this is an active day, so now the call to active days will return 1. And if we continue, that's an active day because 23,000 is greater than or equal to 10,000. But this is not an active day because that number is not greater than or equal to 10,000. So we have 1, 2 active days, and that's why when we call active days right here, it's going to return 2. So let's start to write the method header for that. Let's see. Since this is returning the number of active days, which is an integer, we will say public int. And then the method name was active days. There is no parameter because there's nothing in the parentheses, so I'll just do this. This looks like this is probably going to be our accessor method, because this will return, what does this say? Active days returns the number of active days. So it's going to return something, and that's pretty much all it does. So we actually don't have anything to symbolize the number of active days. So let's go ahead and make a data field for that. Let me zoom out really quick. There we go. Let's make a data field for it. Private int num active days, and we will end up returning that value in our accessor method. So that looks good so far. Now we need to ask ourselves the question, when do we calculate what num active days even is? Like, when do we calculate whether something is an active day or not? Well, it looks like from the looks of the problem, I calculated whether or not it's an active day in the add daily steps method. Because again, 9,000 is not greater than or equal to 10,000, so this is not an active day. 5,000 is not greater than or equal to 10,000 either, but 13,000 is greater than or equal to 10,000, so here this is an active day. So in these two cases where it's not active, I would not increment my data field, but whenever it is an active day, I would increment the data field. So let's try to write this in code. So first we go to add daily steps. Definitely write this in add daily steps. So if the number of steps we took that day is greater than or equal to that minimum. In other words, if the number of steps we took that day is greater than or equal to the minimum number of steps, let's see where that is. So the number of steps we took that day is the parameter. So that would be steps. If that is greater than or equal to, so that has to be greater than or equal to that number that we set in our constructor. What is that symbolized by? Well, we set the number in our constructor to become this data field min steps. So min steps is storing the minimum number of steps needed in order for it to be considered an active day. So we will put that here. So, once again, if the number of steps taken that day is greater than or equal to the minimum number of steps we need in order to be considered active, then what we do is we increment the number of active days. So we take this data field and we increment it. Great, so that should take care of, so far, let me zoom out a little bit. So far, that'll take care of the situations we've covered so far. Let's now go to the last part, which is figuring out the average number of steps. So, let's take a look at this. So in this day, we took 9,000 steps, and in this day, we took 5,000 steps. What's the average number of steps we've taken so far? Well, we have to do 9,000 plus 5,000, which is 14,000, and then divide that by 2, because those are the number of days that we have so far. So if we do that, we get 7,000. Let's look at this other one. So let's say another day we have 13,000. Well, to figure out the average, we need to do 9,000 plus 5,000 plus 13,000, and then divide that by 1, 2, 3. So this would be 27,000 divided by 3, which is 9,000, and that's our average. If you were to do this problem with a list, what you might want to do is store each of these values, the 9,000, the 5,000, and the 13,000, and any value from add daily steps, store that into the list. So before we do that, we need to make a list in our data field. So we'll say private array list of integers, and we'll go ahead and call this, we will call this daily steps list. So now that you've made this list, we should probably initialize it in some sort of way. So again, remember in the constructor how we needed to initialize our data fields? Let's do that now. So num active days, well, when we start making a StepTracker, there are no active days. So let's do that. And then we also need to initialize daily steps list. So we just say the array list integer daily steps list becomes new array list integer parenthesis parenthesis, and that will initialize this to be an empty list. Now, when we're doing the problem, when do we add on the number of steps? Well, we'll add the 9,000 and 5,000 to a list, and that will be an add daily steps. So let's do that. In order to do that, in add daily steps, we would say the name of the list, which is daily steps list. It's just what we put up here, daily steps list dot add, and then however many steps we took that day, which is what was in the parameter here. So we'll just add steps. And that will add each of these numbers to a list. Finally, what we can do is when we are averaging these out, we can just loop through the list and find the average that way. So let's go ahead and do that. So we will look at our average steps method. It looks like it's returning a decimal, so we will say public double average steps. There are no parameters because the parentheses are blank. And so now that we have our data field daily steps list, which holds all the steps values we have so far, let's go ahead and first we need to total these up, then we need to divide by how many days there were. So let's go ahead and start that out. So int total equals 0. So we could say this is the total number of steps, or we could just call this total steps equals 0. Then I would say for int I equals 0, I is less than the name of the list, which is daily steps list. Oops, I'll take it from up here where the data field is. Daily steps list dot size I++. Onto total steps, we will do a plus equals the item in the list. So we would do daily steps list dot get I to grab the item at that position I in the list. So after we do this, this will accumulate all the steps in the list. Finally, what we can do is find the average. So we would just do the total number of steps divided by the number of days. So again, average steps is divide the total number of the steps divided by the number of days. How would I figure out the number of days? Well, if you look here, let's pretend we've got this list. So we add 9,000 to the list, then 5,000, then 13,000, then 23,000, then 11, then 1111. So let's pretend this is our list. Again, we already went through the list, added up all the numbers to get the total number of steps. Now, how do we figure out how many days there were? Well, isn't the number of days really just the size of the list, because each of these numbers represents the number of steps you took per day? So I could just divide this by daily steps list dot size, because the size of the list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in this case, is the number of days that we have done our steps. This is mostly right. Let's take a look and clean some things up. So first of all, total steps is an integer. Daily steps list dot size is also an integer. But do remember that an integer divided by an integer is an integer. So 1 divided by 3 is not 0.3 repeating. It truncates the decimal and it's just 0. However, if I did 1.0 divided by 3, that would give us the decimal that we need, because decimal divided by integer is a decimal. So let's change this first thing to a decimal by typecasting it to double. So I would say return double total steps divided by daily steps list dot size. I'll erase this work in just 3, 2, 1. Alright, another thing we have to keep in mind is divide by 0 errors. Remember, the denominator should not be 0. So, what's our denominator? Well, it is daily steps list dot size. So, to prevent a 0 denominator, we should say if, and we would just say the denominator, daily steps list dot size, equals 0. If we have a 0 denominator, we have to do something about that. So let me erase some of this leftover work. So let's look at the problem. So back here, when no steps have been recorded, they just return 0.0. So that's what we'll do. When no days have been recorded, we'll just return 0.0. And that pretty much takes care of everything for this problem. Let me zoom out and get you a better view. But before we do that, I'll actually show you that you could do this exact same thing with a for each loop if you want. So I'll post that as an alternative solution, just right down here. So instead of this for loop, you could have done a for each loop for my array list. So you could have said, for every item in the array list, since the array list is an array list of integers, you could say, for every integer, and then just any variable name, colon, in the list, we will just add that integer onto the total. And then everything else is pretty much the same. So if you prefer for each loops, feel free to write this solution down. I'm going to reveal the full solution with a for loop in 3, 2, 1. And here is the full solution with a list in which I used a for loop at the bottom. Feel free to write this down. And if you want hints or answers, different types of answers to this same problem, just click on the other videos in the description. Thank you.